I In Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, Richard Hofstadter is here in his first chapter, Anti-Intellectualism in Our Time. He's dealing with some terms that have come in to define and perhaps caricature the intellectual life or the intellectuals of our time. He talks about words like egghead and highbrow here. We might begin with some definitions supplied by those most acutely dissatisfied with American intellectuals. Exhibit A. During the campaign of 1952, the country seemed to be in need of some term to express that disdain for intellectuals, which had by then become a self-conscious motif in American politics. The word egghead was originally used without invidious associations, but quickly assumed them and acquired a much sharper overtone than the traditional highbrow. Shortly after the campaign was over, Lewis Bromfield, a popular novelist of right-wing political persuasion, suggested that the word might someday find its way into dictionaries as follows. And then he suggests this definition. Egghead, a person of spurious intellectual pretensions, often a professor or the protege of a professor, fundamentally superficial, over-emotional, and feminine in reactions to any problem, supercilious and surfeited with conceit and contempt for the experience of more sound and able men, essentially confused in thought and immersed in mixture of sentimentality and violent evangelism, a doctrinaire supporter of Middle European socialism as opposed to Greco-French-American ideas of democracy and liberalism, subject to the old-fashioned philosophical morality of Nietzsche, which frequently leads him into jail or to disgrace. A self-conscious prig, so given to examining all sides of a question that he becomes thoroughly addled while remaining always in the same spot. An anemic, bleeding heart. The recent election, Bromfield remarked, demonstrated a number of things, not the least of them being the extreme remoteness of the egghead from the thought and feeling of the whole of the people. Exhibit B. Almost 2 years later, President Eisenhower appeared to give official sanction to a similarly disdainful view of intellectuals. Speaking at a Republican meeting in Los Angeles in 1954, he reported a view expressed to him by a trade union leader that the people, presented with the whole truth, will always support the right cause. The president added, quote, It was a rather comforting thought to have this labor leader saying this when we had so many wisecracking so-called intellectuals going around and showing how wrong was everybody who don't happen to agree with them. By the way, I heard a definition of an intellectual that I thought was very interesting. A man who takes more words than are necessary to tell more than he knows. That's the end of the Eisenhower quote. Exhibit C. One of the issues at stake in the controversies of the 1950s was the old one about the place of expertise in political life. Perhaps the high moment in the case against the expert and for the amateur occurred in 1957 when a chain store president, Maxwell H. Gluck, was nominated to be ambassador to Ceylon. Mr. Gluck had contributed, by his own estimate, $20,000 or $30,000 to the Republican campaign of 1956, but like many such appointees before him, was not known for having any experience in politics or diplomacy. Questioned by Senator Fulbright about his qualifications for the post, Mr. Gluck had some difficulty. Fulbright said, What are the problems in Ceylon you think you can deal with? Gluck said, One of the problems are the people there. I believe I can. I think I can establish, unless I run into something that I have not run into before, a good relationship and good feeling toward the United States. Fulbright, do you know our ambassador to India? Gluck, I know John Sherman Cooper, the previous ambassador. Fulbright, do you know who the Prime Minister of India is? Gluck, yes, but I can't pronounce his name. Fulbright, do you know who the Prime Minister of Ceylon is? Gluck, his name is unfamiliar now. I cannot call it off. Doubts about Mr. Gluck's preparation for the post he was to occupy led to the suggestion that he had been named because of his contribution to the Republican campaign. In a press conference held July 31st, 1957, a reporter raised the question, whereupon President Eisenhower remarked that an appointment in return for campaign contributions was unthinkable. About his nominee's competence, he observed, quote, "Now, as to the man's ignorance, this is the way he was appointed. He was selected from a group of men that were recommended highly by a number of people I respect. His business career was examined. The FBI reports on him were all good. Of course, we knew he had never been to Ceylon. He wasn't thoroughly familiar with it, but certainly he can learn if he is the kind of character and kind of man we believe him to be." End of quote. It is important to add that Mr. Gluck's service in Ceylon was terminated after a year by his resignation. Exhibit D. One of the grievances of American scientists was their awareness that America's disdain for pure science was a handicap not only to investigation but also to the progress of research and development in the Department of Defense. Examining Secretary of Defense Charles E. Wilson in 1954 before the Senate Committee on Armed Services, Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri quoted earlier testimony in which the Secretary had said, among other things, that if there was to be a pure research, it should be subsidized by some agency other than the Department of Defense. "I am not much interested," Secretary Wilson had testified, "as a military project to why potatoes turn brown when they are fried." Pressing Secretary Wilson, Senator Symington pointed to testimony that had been given about the lack of sufficient money for research, not on potatoes, but on bombers, nuclear propulsion, electronics, missiles, radar, and other subjects. The Secretary replied, quote, "Important research and development is going on in all these areas. On the other side, it is very difficult to get these men who are trying to think out ahead all the time to come down to brass tacks and list the projects and what they expect to get. They would just like to have a pot of money without too much supervision that they could reach into. In the first place, if you know what you are doing, why it is not pure research, that complicates it." What? Yeah. I have trouble following the argument too. Seems that is Richard Hofstadter's point in all of these exhibits. More exhibits next time. I'll put in a link to Jacques Ellul's book. Jacques Ellul, in the same era, that is the 1940s, 50s, 60s, was very concerned with the power of propaganda and the effect it was having on the general population. So I'll put in a link to an excerpt from his book, Propaganda. See you next time.